All right, we are now live. Got one person here already. I'll just talk a little bit as we get started and people start streaming in. So, this is the AMA session for October 2019. You can ask me anything that you like, and I will respond in real time. Once the questions start piling in, there's quite a few of them usually. So you want to get your questions in fairly early on. We'll go for about an hour and a half or so. Um, we kind of play around with the deadlines. Towards the end, I will just start taking whatever questions I can easily and quickly answer. So I'm up here in the bedroom right now, and as you can see, I'm by my bookshelf. So some of you may have seen that bookshelf tour video. All right, so we've got some questions already. Mike Ray, what are your thoughts on Bernie Sanders? I like Bernie Sanders. If you've ever watched his videos of interacting with his constituents way back when he was mayor of Burlington, he has a kind of human touch that many politicians these days really seem to lack. As a matter of fact, without being a leftist myself, actually being a registered independent, there's a lot of his platform that I think at this point in time is quite timely. So as a candidate, I like him quite a bit. We'll see what happens. There's some concerns about his health right now, but I think that'll probably even out. So that's probably enough about that since we've got a lot of other questions popping up here. Mohammed, I'm not going to take the question on Jordan Peterson because I've talked about him so many times. That's easy enough to find. Memento Mori, what is my opinion on Foucault? Do I think he's right about the way power works in our current societies? Yeah, I like Foucault. I think that Foucault, like a lot of the 20th century sort of cutting edge French thinkers, um, you don't want to be a Foucauldian, right? But it's good to draw on the places where I think he gets things right. I think he and Pierre Hadot are both right about the notion of spiritual practices and technologies of the self. Of course, as Hadot makes very clear, he's not an innovator in that respect, and what he's calling philosophy as a way of life has been practiced by many people long before he was, and there were a lot of other 20th century French intellectuals who were talking about that as well, like Gabriel Marcel or Maurice Blondel or people like that. And I think Foucault is right about that. I think he's actually right in some of his analyses of power. I like his distinction between domination, exploitation, and subjectification. I think that's quite useful, particularly in our digital age. So yeah, Foucault is definitely worth studying. You don't want to be like Foucault fanboy, of course, any more than you do on anybody else. All right. The proof architect, Dr. Sadler, how could Schopenhauer have reconciled with the supply and demand politics of his lectures without getting angry at Hegel? My thoughts. So, what are we talking about with the supply and demand politics of lectures? Lecturers in the academy, where, by the way, Hegel had played a role in getting Schopenhauer his job in the first place, they were based on the number of students that you had studying in your classes. So the number of students attending lectures. Schopenhauer decided to schedule his lectures at exactly the same time as Hegel's because he wanted to show up this fraud Hegel who was getting Kant wrong and all of that sort of business. And of course, nobody showed up to Schopenhauer's lectures. I mean, a few people did, but not as many as Hegel's. He didn't need to schedule it that way. He didn't need to frame things in that way. Now, to be fair, he was young, and I think I've gone through my own hothead, very rigid period in my life as an intellectual. So maybe Schopenhauer was going through something like that. It doesn't appear to have bothered Hegel much. So he didn't have the effect that I think that he wanted to have. Hegel didn't really pay much attention to it at all. He had bigger fish to fry, so to speak. So, all right, Leonardo Rodriguez. My question is about the difference between your vision of Hegel and Slavoj Žižek's interpretation. I don't know that I can actually even answer that. I mean, Žižek is kind of all over the map, right? And I can't say that I have like a comprehensive vision of precisely what Žižek has in mind, and I don't think that I actually have my own interpretation as such. I try to stay as close to the text as possible. I don't aim to be an original thinker. I mean, if I do say something that's new or original, it's usually by mistake, you know, and it might be wrong. Um, I see Hegel, and to begin with, I'm not a Hegelian myself. I just see Hegel as somebody who's useful, and he had his finger on a lot of interesting points. So he's worth studying. But like Foucault, you can take what you need from Hegel, the insights that you think are worthwhile, and you don't have to buy into all the rest. So that's about as close as an answer I think I can get to. Um, Dan the Man, how do you think we could get philosophy or just the humanities in general more respected in modern society? So that's a great question. I think part of it has to do with humanities people not being so optimistic about their capacity to communicate with other people, or about the importance of what it is that they're talking about. You've got to make a case for what it is that you want to say is important, and you have to do it in the language as best as you can of non-academics. So, I mean, that's what I strive to do in my videos, and I do that in my academic classes, and I do that with the idea that this is the one chance that I get. I got to put my hair back a little bit better. This is the one chance that I get to be an ambassador for my discipline, and also for the people that we're reading. So this is probably my one chance to introduce people to Aristotle or Anselm or Descartes. I don't want to screw it up. I don't want to leave them with a bad taste in their mouth. That is just a reminder that they wasted their time in that semester. I want them to desire to read more. And so I do that in my public lectures. I do that in most of the things that I do. And for me, that comes fairly naturally, except perhaps with my writing. My writing is a bit convoluted at times. But I mean, you hear me speaking right now, right? I can talk like an ordinary person. And I think that a lot of other academics, they probably have to work at it more. They have to think, they have to remind themselves, hey, I may think that this historical development is something really cool and important, but it's up to me to make that case to other people. Doesn't mean we have to dumb it down. It doesn't mean that we have to water it down. As a matter of fact, my experience is that audiences, if you can reach them, they really do appreciate rigor and comprehensiveness. But you've got to do that bridge work first. And so, we actually have people in our field of philosophy who, thematize that. Aristotle, Cicero, right? They both said it's important to know your stuff, but it's also important to be attentive to rhetoric, and not rhetoric in the sense of just vulgar manipulation, sophistic rhetoric or anything like that. But you've got to be able to take into account who your audience is, and think in terms of categories like ethos, structure. All of that's quite important. So I think when we do humanities well, that's part of what we're doing. All right, Multipie, how do I feel about Leo Strauss? He's interesting. I'm not a Straussian. I've read a lot of his work. I find some of his stuff useful. I think that his favorite thing, the esoteric exoteric distinction, is largely nonsense. That was wishful thinking on his part. Became his shtick. I think it works with some people, but I don't buy it the way that he does it. as sort of his thing. I don't like Straussians. They usually tend to be I mean, I've met a few really interesting ones, but that's usually because they're not as Straussian as they could be. Um, Movement people, joiners, especially a few generations after the key person in the movement is gone, tend to be kind of just follower types. And I think it's not I think you could say, well, Straussians are usually sort of in general a higher class than say Randians, but um, they're all just kind of like in awe of the master, or they're just using him for for something, uh, to get some traction. So, all right. Al asks, are there philosophical thoughts on the use of play? Yeah. I mean, Johan Huizinga, the Dutch historian, actually has a whole book called "On the Play Aspect in Culture" that I sometimes teach when I'm teaching Introduction to Human Nature courses. He's somebody to look at. I mean, when you talk about play, there's like a whole literature out there discussing like play and games and things like that. And then there's also the literature having to do with humor and jokes and stuff like that. So I would start looking around in that framework. There was a book that I haven't read for a very, very long time, but I remember enjoying it when I was a teenager, called Finite and Infinite Games, that seemed quite interesting and that might bear some fruit for that as well. All right. Spencer Mead, what is the most significant difference between Aristotle's eudaimonia and Epicurus's contentment as the end of man? Well, Epicurus doesn't say contentment. I mean, the thumbnail sketches of Epicurus say ataraxia, right? Undisturbedness, literally, is what they're after. But Epicurus uses the word eudaimonia too. So everybody in ancient virtue ethics talks about eudaimonia. The difference is that for Epicurus, it consists in two main elements. One is enjoying pleasures, active pleasures, like say drinking this coffee, and also in a sort of state of absence or from pain or rest from troubles. So the ataraxia part comes in. Ideally, you want to have both of those, right? Aristotle says pleasure is not really the fundamental goal. It's something that is sort of the icing on the cake. And Aristotle puts forth essentially two different and distinct viewpoints on what the best life would be, the life of happiness. One is it's a political or social life that is focused on developing and using the virtues, and so it's committed within could be your society, could be within your family, could be within your work space or something like that. And then there's the contemplative life, which is one of theoria, literally looking at things, and it's kind of good to distinguish this from a life of, say, spectator consumerism. Like Aristotle doesn't think that the life of watching Netflix endlessly, and then switching to Amazon and switching to Hulu and just watching shows would be a life of what he's calling theoria. Something more active is involved, right? You're learning something about reality. Not to say that watching some things couldn't be helpful with that, and not just documentaries, but even like really good dramas. Um, but those are what Aristotle's proposing, and so pleasure comes into that, and some degree of like absence of pain or trouble is involved there as well. I'll mention too that a later Aristotelian, Hieronymus, who we only know by reference, Cicero talks about him in On the Ends, and it looks like Plutarch used some of Hieronymus's On Anger to write his own on restraining anger. Hieronymus thought, like the Epicureans did, that absence of pain or trouble as a good. He saw that as the ultimate good, that happiness consisted in that. But he's rather unorthodox as an Aristotelian along those lines. So, all right, Jermel, what do I think the most impactful work of philosophy is? That's tough. I mean, if you're talking about like the one that has changed the most people's lives or affected their existence, I don't know. You know, um, I mean, if we're thinking about it in a global perspective, that makes it even tougher, doesn't it? Because I mean, you could say Confucius's Analects, not written by Confucius, of course, but by later disciples. Massive cultural influence, right? And since the Chinese have in recent years decided that Confucius is all right with them and sort of rehabilitated him for communist orthodoxy, then I suppose maybe that or one of the other Confucian classics could be one of the most important. I mean, some people would probably say like, oh, Marx's Capital, but Capital is one of those books that a lot of people talk about and reference. It's sort of like the Bible. Very few people actually read much of it. Even the people who constantly go on and on about it. I don't know. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics has had a massive influence. It's really tough to say. That's a great question, and I don't really have a good answer for that. All right, Jake, do you think psychoanalysis still has any merit, or should it be treated as a pseudoscience of the past? Well, I mean, you should never use the word pseudoscience without thoroughly knowing what you're looking into. And I think if you look into psychoanalysis, you'll say that some of it is kind of sketchy and some of it isn't. And it's probably better to talk about psychoanalysis in the plural rather than trying to generalize about all of it. It's not like you can read Freud and suddenly know about contemporary psychoanalytics. They've moved on quite a lot from that, right? Even though they still use some things from Freud. Even Lacan had to, talk about in his own time how just 20 years after, some of these ideas of Freud are essentially hitting the bricks, people have managed to misunderstand them and misapply them and turn psychoanalysis into something it isn't. So I think that there are some very useful insights and practices in psychoanalysis in certain psychoanalytic schools. I mean, you notice when I talk about psychoanalysis, my references are usually to Lacan and Freud and Kohut and people like that, and Winnicott too, so you can say the same thing with Alistair McIntyre, who, when he had the chance to do a seminar, a faculty summer seminar, the one that I was part of, he chose to focus on Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, on rational choice theory, and on Freud and Lacan. There's good reasons for that, because it's not all just nonsense. And the other thing I think you want to keep in mind is when you use the word pseudoscience, you need to have very clearly in mind what you take science to be. And when we're talking about the human sciences, don't expect that just because you've looked up the scientific method or something like that, that's exactly how things work in the human sciences or the social sciences. It's not like working with physics, for example. So, all right, Julian, really interesting question here. How can you take your ego out of philosophical discussions and try to understand and learn rather than win? Well, right there, identifying that as a problem is part of the solution, isn't it? So you can become aware of when you're falling back into that old pattern. Because if this is an issue for you, you've probably done this a lot, and so it feels kind of, there's like a natural progression, right? At first you're interested in understanding something, and then maybe somebody says something and it pisses you off, and your ego is now engaged. And when we talk about your ego being engaged, we're really talking about two things. One is, you're trying to protect your self-image, and so you get defensive about things or go on the attack. But it's also, the ego is a complex of all these patterns and habits, and so these can proceed rather automatically unless you're paying attention to them. To go back to the psychoanalysis question, that's one of the things you do in therapy, right? And it's not like the psychoanalysts have the corner on that. Um, Previous forms of what we would call spiritual direction did that. That's something that people were attentive to in philosophy as a way of life in terms of virtue ethics. The cognitive revolution does that as well, but that's something really central. You got to like actually pay attention to what you're typically doing, so the habits don't control you, and you start to get some capacity to intervene in the habits. And then it's a long, laborious process of like reminding yourself that you don't want to be a prick, and that letting your ego and desire to win, and this is a long, the Greeks had a word for this, philonikia, desire for victory, right? This is a basic human drive that leads us astray. Aristotle, even when he's talking about weakness or failure of will, akrasia in Greek, he singles out philonikia as one of the types of or one of the motivators for certain types of akrasia. So this is a very common issue. I think one of the things you can do is you can remind yourself of some of the bad consequences that come about. This sort of wish to contend. It screws up friendships. It makes people not want to work with you. It makes them distrustful of your motives. So, it's ultimately not good for you on the way. So that I'd say that's one thing you can do that can help out. Let's see here. Just skipped very quickly. Just jumped over a bunch of stuff. Wow, a lot of questions here. Okay, so here we're back. Proof Architect, how do you think the discussion of censorship policy as talked in Book 2 of the Republic differs from how we talk about censorship today? Well, censorship is, again, let's think in the plural, right? Is there one single thing that's how we talk about censorship today? I don't think so. And Plato is talking about one kind of idea about censorship, that we censor in a paternalistic way to try to keep people from believing a bunch of lies. And those lies could be things like, the gods like to fight with each other. Socrates does indeed have a different conception of the gods than most people did back then. All right, Mr. Dharampaji, how difficult do you think it is to get funding for a PhD in the U.S. for philosophy and anthropology? I wouldn't know about anthropology. I'm not an anthropologist at all. I can tell you that it's harder to get funding for the PhD, but before you get a PhD, you need an MA, right? So don't plan on jumping straight from the undergrad bachelor's straight into a PhD program, because unless your GRE scores are off the charts, or you've got some special program that you're in, that's usually not the way it works. Funding is up to the schools. When I was in school, it was pretty common that if you had funding, it covered all of your tuition and gave you a stipend. The Marquette graduate students that I work with, they are only getting half or a third of their tuition actually paid for by the school. They got to come up with the rest with loans or other fellowships or things like that. It's much tougher today. But there isn't any like one single hard and fast answer because, as I pointed out many times, we don't have an educational system. We have a patchwork of many, many different institutions and systems all working together. So, what you would want to do is actually start talking to people in programs at places that you might want to go and say, how does funding work here? And see what they have to say. You want to be a little bit not so high up perspective. You want to like get a bit more, as we say, granular with it, right? No crack. What do you personally get out of Maurice Blondell's thinking? I love people who can, try to take in the complexity of life and existence, and Blondell was even better than Hegel at that. His writing is not, for everybody. I mean, if you like Cicero, you'll probably like Blondell because you've got these giant Ciceronian paragraph-long sentences. Many people in his own time didn't like that, but I really like his sort of scope of thought and his relentlessness, and there's a lot of admirable things about him. So, yeah. Um, let's see. Boben Orlovic. What are Schilling and Fichte all about? Are they proto-Hegelians? Information is scarce unless you want to read them yourself. Yeah, read them yourself. I mean, uh, why wouldn't you just read them? I mean, and information is not scarce about them. I mean, there's encyclopedia entries devoted to them. You just got to do a bit of searching, right? There's lots and lots of articles out there about them. If you go on academia.edu, you'll find lots of people writing about them. I mean, to answer your actual question, are they proto-Hegelians? I mean, Fichte more than Schelling, I'd say. Schelling is kind of doing his own thing, and he and Hegel worked together very closely, by the way, in their early years. I mean, Hegel is using some stuff from Fichte, but Fichte is also a figure in his own right. So, I'd start reading some of their stuff and see what you make of it. Seb Morley just started reading a book about Girard. Do you have any opinion on him? If you're talking about Rene Girard, yeah, I think that the idea of mimetic desire is a brilliant insight, and I don't know that I buy into like the whole logic of sacrifice stuff, but he's an interesting thinker. Definitely deserves more attention than he gets. Mary Ruth says, "Love your T-shirt." Yeah, I got this for joining the KISS Army, and I've been listening to KISS since I was about 6, 7. One of the kids on my block had KISS Alive, and yeah, we used to like, we would be there drawing with crayons. We'd always like draw, KISS stuff. I was fascinated with Ace Frehley, the spaceman. So, who I got to see in concert just a year ago or 2 years ago. Quite good. Martin Costa, thoughts on Thomas Pynchon's fiction? I don't read it. Here's another one. Johan Erlandson, have you read David Bentley's Heart new book, That All Shall Be Saved, Heaven, Hell, and Universal Salvation? Nope. I'm so busy. I don't get time to read an awful lot of stuff outside of the things I'm working on or teaching. So, yeah. Mohammed, what philosophy do you recommend to individuals with STEM backgrounds? Same as every other, I always say start with Plato. The fact that you have a STEM background doesn't make you special. You have the same human capacities as anyone else, unless you choose to like identify yourself in sort of a blindered way as a STEM individual. You know, is there anything in particular for STEM people? I mean, you decide that. It's not like there's such a thing as STEM people. Some sort of character trait. You interact with people who are in engineering or the sciences. They're a very mixed bag, aren't they? So you're going to read the same philosophy stuff as anybody else if you want to make progress in philosophy. Yoel Marcelo Fernandez, what's the relation between the prime mover and nature in Aristotle? I kind of understood that things grow and move because of want of the prime mover, but I might be very mistaken. Could you clarify this? There's not much to clarify. Aristotle doesn't tell us an awful lot about that, so it's not really worth spending a lot of time on because it's what we call underdetermined. Um, and the things that Aristotle has, here's something I'll say. The things that Aristotle has to say, where it's kind of just sort of like thrown out there and there isn't that much to it, it's probably not Aristotle you want to read. It's commentators on Aristotle who then are picking up these issues and working them out further, rather than just like trying to cobble together something interesting out of all these little passages here and there. Why not look at somebody who has more to say about it, like Alexander of Aphrodisias, or jump ahead to the medieval Aristotelians. Um, or I'm sure there's probably plenty of stuff on that in the Islamic Aristotelians, although I don't read Arabic, so I don't have anything to say about that. Um, all right, Leonora, do I think that Heidegger and Hegel are as helpful, useful to the personal life as Stoics, or are they just useful for academic purposes? Well, that's a bit of a false dilemma there, isn't it? Either things are like as useful as the Stoics for ordinary life, or they're merely academic. I mean, it depends on what kind of life you have, doesn't it? Heidegger is like full of brilliant insights into how we perceive things in our environment. Why would you not want access to that? I mean, that's already there in being and time. It's not like there's Heideggerian exercises the way there are with the Stoics, but sometimes you can kind of figure it out as you go along. But if you push it to the side as like merely academic, that's gonna sort of taint what you're doing with it. Hegel is tougher to use, I would say, than Heidegger in that respect. But there's plenty of stuff that you could draw out of the phenomenology, looking at particular dynamics. Especially the stuff everybody wants to go to the master-slave dialectic. Just forget about that for a while. Focus on what's going on in the middle part of the work, the real core, the reason and the spirit sections. And there's like all these really cool dynamics where you're reading it and you're like, holy crap, that's like what happened last week, or holy crap, that's like what's going on in the culture wars right now. And so that can be very helpful. And you don't have to like pick and choose between them too. You can, when I work with clients, for philosophical counseling, I'm often bringing up the Stoics, but I'm also bringing up the Aristotelians and Platonists and existentialists and dialectical philosophy, and sometimes psychoanalytic thinkers where they're appropriate. You just bring all these elements together. So yeah. All right. Let's see here. Sideralaxon. I want Schopenhauer's philosophy to be my area of research. I want to ask you something else. How may one look at addiction, say, through the lens of idealism? Well, whose idealism? You mean Schopenhauer's? Do you mean Hegel's? They're both idealists. I think they'd have different answers. I mean, the first thing to do is start digging around in their texts and see if they discuss addiction in interesting ways. But I don't know that I have much more to say beyond that. All right. Amal Ibeltulen, thoughts on Orthodox Christianity and the essence energy distinction? I don't have any thoughts on that. Have you read a dialogue between an Orthodox and a Barlamite? I don't think so. Dylan, do I believe there is intelligent life elsewhere in the universe? I don't really have a belief about that because I mean, I don't know. So obviously, if somebody shows up and walks off their ship or something like that, then I'll believe it. But I don't say, well, there can't be any life because we haven't heard anything from it. There are a lot of different possibilities. Space is vast. So I just don't know. Phantom Upload, what are your thoughts on Heraclitus? Heraclitus is interesting, but there's not much to be done with him because we've just got fragments. We don't have his book on nature. And so he's what you call a wax nose. Anybody can make of him what they want. It appears that there were like Heracliteans back in the day because Plato talks about that a little bit, and Lucian of Samosata references them as a sect. Somebody else does as well. I think maybe Cicero or Plutarch does. But we really don't know much about him. So I think it's important to focus on what we've got the most of, rather than trying to piece together, some sort of Heraclitean doctrine. Jeff Sullivan, any thoughts on Spinoza? It seems like you're a big fan of Leibniz and Descartes. Thanks for your work. Yeah, good luck with the crazy workload this month. Yeah, this month is indeed crazy as we move up to Stoicon, Milwaukee. Spinoza is interesting. I see him as sort of a dead end. I don't have the enthusiasm for him that many other people seem to have, but I think that a lot of that enthusiasm is reading other things into him. Reading their own stuff into them. I mean, for example, with Deleuze, when you go to Deleuze and History of Philosophy, you're getting like maybe 1/3 actual History of Philosophy and 2/3 Deleuze, and it's fun because Deleuze is pretty cool, and interesting. But let's not pretend that it's actual like History of Philosophy focusing very closely on the figure. And I just I don't get that much out of Spinoza. I mean, I've studied him, I've taught him occasionally, but he's just it's not that interesting to me. Not like Descartes is. So, Proof Architect, what do you consider the difference between existentialism and absurdism? I don't think there is a difference because I don't think either one of them is a sharply defined concept. I think that anybody can call themselves an absurdist, and I think that historically, existentialism is what we call a family resemblance concept. And I think that Camus' philosophy of the absurd, which is not absurdism, is a form of existentialism. It has I don't really care about his denial of that because Heidegger also says he's not an existentialist, and so does Marcel. They're all existentialists. They're just existentialists in different ways. We shouldn't get so caught up on worrying about these division lines, especially when we're dealing with movements that are quite fluid like that. Dominic, do you have any tips for slow readers? It's actually a good thing to be a slow reader because there are so many people out there today who like brag about how many books they're reading, and how fast they got through, this and that, and or even like these people who like they watch videos and they're like, I watched it at 1 3/4 speed, and I'm like, that sounds really dumb. I mean, that's like a great recipe for making sure you have a sort of trivial, superficial understanding of things, and reading slowly is actually a good thing to do. It requires you to, in the Middle Ages, they used the metaphor of rumination, right? You ruminate upon what you're reading. You chew by thinking it over, by reflecting. It's not a goal to like get through it right away. So it may not be that bad of a thing that you read slowly. Maybe you're paying closer attention, All right. Mia Bayer, what should I read if I want to understand spirits the way that Rilke understood them? Probably a lot of Rilke. I mean, what have you read? Probably some poems and letters to a young poet. He writes a lot. There's you can get collected letters of Rilke in which he explains a lot of his ideas to other people in the letters. So that I would do that. For sure. I was wondering if you could explain what the pre-Socratics, Plato, and Aristotle thought physical matter was. Did they think it wasn't just material, but something more? I would go to Metaphysics Book 1 for some of that, because Aristotle actually talks about his predecessors and what he takes them to have thought it was. In the case of many of the pre-Socratics, we don't have much of their writings. So, and the word for matter is hule in Greek, right, which originally means wood. So clearly, it's an idea that gets generalized. It's different in Aristotle than it is in Plato. It's different in Plato, it appears, than it was in some of his predecessors, although we don't know that much about them. Um, so I would take a look at what Aristotle has to say in Metaphysics Book 1, and then go back and read some of them. Um, All right, the proof architect. What do I think of mathematical finitists or constructivists? I don't know enough about them. It's been so long since I've been doing philosophy of mathematics that I don't have anything valuable to say. Alejandro Ramos. I've been recently getting into Deleuze and want to read Anti-Oedipus. Should I drive right into it? Well, that's an interesting question that you ask, because Anti-Oedipus is not Deleuze. Anti-Oedipus is Deleuze and Guattari. And my feeling, people can say I'm totally wrong about this, is that Deleuze is more interesting when he's writing on his own than when he's writing with Guattari. I don't think that Guattari was really a good influence on Deleuze's thought in some respects. But that could be just personal, like I really enjoy the logic of sense, and maybe that's a good place to start. Or the histories of the history of philosophy stuff that he's got. I like those books, even though they're, like I said, more Deleuze than Leibniz or Spinoza or Nietzsche or whoever. I'm not that big on Anti-Oedipus. I mean, it can't hurt to read it. That was my introduction to Deleuze. As a matter of fact, I'm going to take a little pause. I'll tell you a funny story. So, in undergraduate, I went to this place called Lakeland College, which is now Lakeland University. And like a lot of places, they got themselves an education program. And I think they have a nursing program now, maybe offer an MBA or something like that. And they've gotten rid of their philosophy program, which makes sense because, there was never that many majors in it. And quite frankly, the people that were teaching there in philosophy, they were not particularly good at the field. Nor did they stay on top of things. So what they told us basically was, and the contemporary philosophy class, sort of depicted this. There's analytic philosophy, which was, getting its start with like Russell and Moore and Wittgenstein, and going, up to people like Quine and all of that. And they actually had quite a few kind of cool analytic philosophy stuff that was fairly cutting edge in the library, but none of the teachers were reading it. Then they thought, there's American philosophy like pragmatism, but that's not really philosophy. Then there's process philosophy. That's real metaphysics. And then there's existentialism, and that was the representative of continental philosophy. I mean, if you wanted to, you could read some Hegel, but nobody really cared about him. And so I'm taking this modern philosophy class with 4 other students, one of whom was a Japanese guy whose family had made a killing in the real estate market in Tokyo. And so he was just over at Lakeland studying, and he could buy all sorts of books. His name is Yoshihiro. And about halfway through the semester, he said to me, because he didn't speak English very well, he's like, if I write a paper, would you present the paper for me? Because we had to write papers and present them in the class. And I was like, yeah, that's not a problem. Be happy to take a look at what you're writing. So he's like, well, you're going to need these books in order to understand what I'm talking about. And he gave me Anti-Oedipus and some Foucault stuff. Bakhtin, he gave me like 2 books by him. One was the Dostoevsky Poetics book, and I think the other one was maybe the Rabelais book. And there was a bunch of other stuff in there too, and it was stuff that I hadn't been exposed to, right? And so I started reading through this stuff, and then I read his paper. His paper came to be like 50 pages long, and it was basically making the argument that modern philosophy had gone from being dialogic to monologic, probably true in some respects. And I started reading this stuff and I was getting into it. And I was like, yeah, this is really cool. But I couldn't say that I fully understood. I probably didn't even half understood a good portion of what I was reading. But then I had those books, right? And now I carry them with me and go from place to place, and they became part of my sort of repertoire. But I didn't really start reading Deleuze other than Anti-Oedipus in a serious way until graduate school, and that was kind of nice. So yeah, I mean, yeah, you could dive right into Anti-Oedipus. Realize that it's a little bit dated in some respects. He's really complaining about the French psychotherapeutic and dominated by psychoanalytic establishment. That's really what the book is focusing on when it comes to that sort of stuff. A lot of the targets for the book are kind of long dead, but you can still get something out of it. So yeah. All right. Renew. Do I think there's a chance that the gods talked about in On the Nature of the Gods could actually be ancient aliens from long ago? I mean, anything is possible, but that's not one that I'm actually going to put any interpretive weight on, because I don't buy into that sort of mythology, and it is just a mythology of ancient aliens, being gods, that sort of business. All right. Andrew, why do people turn to dangerous pleasures rather than using reason? Well, I mean, sometimes they do use reason, figuring out how to get more of those dangerous pleasures, don't they? Right. I mean, you're kind of answering the question. They don't use reason the way that they ought to, in a more substantive way, and so they jump into dangerous pleasures. And there's all sorts of reasons. I mean, oftentimes people want pleasures in order to compensate for how much their life sucks. They want to use it to, as people say, feel alive, or sometimes to numb themselves, or sometimes as a compensation. My life sucks here, so I should have this pleasure here. Sometimes it becomes habitual. A lot of times it's because they're in an environment where people are not only pursuing and enjoying, but also valuing pleasures more than other things. I mean, that's one of the things. If you grow up poor, it's not like poor people are not as smart in managing money as other people, just sort of naturally, and that's why they're poor. That's a bullshit, backwards explanation. Part of what happens when you're poor is you're stuck in situations where you have to make shitty choices over and over and over again, and those often wind up resulting in habits being formed, like thinking about just the present moment because the lights might be out next week. So I mean, this is sort of like one of the big questions that you see virtue ethics theories dealing with. Mr. Despair, have you ever been pissed off at a philosophical concept? That's a good one. I don't know. Where you're like, holy shit, that's so stupid. How could anyone possibly believe it? Maybe. I mean, I don't have anything that pops into my head. I do get ticked off at people who believe really stupid ideas, particularly when they've had the opportunity to learn, how stupid those ideas are, and to acquire better ideas. But I don't think I get angry at the ideas themselves. I suppose there's probably a lot of people out there who do, though. I mean, like, think about when somebody is like, that's fascist, man, or, oh, that's, it's kind of funny because fascism, yeah, we should associate that with bad stuff. That's socialist, man. Socialism could be good or bad, depends on what kind of socialism it is. But if you have an automatic knee-jerk reaction, like many Americans do to the very word socialism, that's something to look into, I think, right? Proof Architect asks again, do you know if certain philosophy departments have reservations of teaching Heidegger because of his Nazi affiliation? How do you try to advocate his philosophy is valuable? Yeah, there's some. There's also a lot of them that don't teach Heidegger because he's continental. A lot of analytic dominated departments that don't teach Hegel either, or Nietzsche, or Thomas Aquinas, or don't even effectively teach Descartes. They probably teach Descartes, but then they stop after the second meditation, you know, or things like that. But yeah, there's some who don't. There's a serious discussion out there about how much of his work is tainted by Nazism, and you've got everything from like all of it to only the stuff that explicitly mentions National Socialism to somewhere in the middle. Being in Time, arguably not Nazi. Black Notebooks, obviously Nazi. So it really depends. How do you advocate his philosophy is valuable? You show it. You show that there's things in it that can be used. All right. Oh, nice. Alejandro, been recommending your channel to everyone I can think find it helpful. Keep doing what you're doing. Love from Colombia. It's nice that it's getting out there. I mean, I kind of wish that YouTube did a better job in providing closed caption translations, but even the English closed caption stuff isn't really that great. So, but it's cool that people are watching it. So. Zorba, what is my view on big data and how it's used to understand human behavior? That's a great question. So I think a lot of people, and I've seen this, I mean, this is before the era of big data. I would see this a lot when I go to political science conventions to talk with the poli-sci theory people. And I'd stray into the quantitative analysis things, and I'd be like, holy crap, is this terrible science? These categories that they've got set up from the conservative to liberal perspective, they've got these numbers, and if you trigger this thing the right way, you're in this hopper and that hopper. And I'd be like, there are so many methodological assumptions being made here that I don't think they're aware of. And all they'd want to do is quibble about which statistical model did you use. And I'd be like, you guys have fundamental ground problems here. I think that's the case with big data. I think that it's really a matter of generating lots of information, much of which is crap information, and it'll get used for stuff, and then we're all kind of stuck with the results. So there's this really funny sci-fi story, and I don't remember who wrote it, but Earth is at war with another planet. And the two planets are shooting missiles at each other that blow up each other's stuff, and Earth wins the war. And it's due to this gigantic computer that was processing all the data and then giving the orders to the military what to do. And the chiefs of all the divisions get together after that, and they're like, one of them's like, I got a confession to make. When we were feeding information to the computer, we couldn't actually trust the information that was coming to us from the spies and reporters and all that. So we kind of fudged the data that we put in there. And that's a problem because, right, garbage in, garbage out with the computers. And then the computer, the military people were like, well, I mean, it sounds bad, but actually it's not that bad because the computer gave us orders, and then on some of them we followed them, but others, we were like, this is not a good order, so we're gonna fake it and say that the computer said this to do this, particular attack or something like that. But we're gonna do what we think is best. And then the technicians who actually handled the computer itself were like, well, we got a confession to make too. The computer was never really operating the way it was supposed to, so we actually processed a lot of the data ourselves and then spit out the answers that we thought should be the right ones. And then they all had a good chuckle because, as it turned out, you didn't really need the computer in the first place. It was just sort of a prop. A lot of big data is like that. People use it to justify what they want to do. Mason, any tips to help learn Latin? Depends on how you learn. I think that there's a lot of good programs out there. I mean, I learned my Latin a long time ago, so I don't teach Latin, so I don't really focus on that. But some of the people that I correspond with tell me that there's like cool computer programs that help you out, and there's always wheel lock. Um, all right, let me skip down a bit. No crack, no smack. What philosophers would you recommend that talk about spite? Aristotle is one of the first people that I know that talks about something like that at a few places in his work. He talks about what we translate as spite, eperasmos, as a cause of anger in Rhetoric Book 2. Um, he also discusses malice, epiheria, literally setting your hands. Uh, no, not epiheria. I can't remember the name, but it literally means like setting your hand to wickedness, right? Um, Spite is when you like screw with somebody and you're not even getting anything out of it. It's different than hubris, where you're like, I'm superior to you because I pissed in your boots or something like that. Spite, you're not even going to get anything out of it. You still piss in the person's boots or whatever you're going to do, right? So Aristotle talks about it. And who else talks about it? Maliciousness. There's a lot of Christian thinkers who mention it here and there. Usually it's going to be rooted in something, right? The person says they're not getting anything out of it, but if we analyzed it, maybe they view it as a chance to like pay somebody back or something like that. All right, Miss Mistian, what kind of world do you think we'll be living in 2050? So how old will I be? It's almost 2020. I'm going to be 50 in 2020. I'd be 70 in 2050. um, I don't know. I mean, it looks like climate change is happening, so it might be a world where there's a lot less land space. Things might be a good bit hotter overall, and a lot of global instability because of it. That's what the U.S. military thinks, by the way, and the Rand Corporation and people who make bets on these sorts of things. Um, I don't know. I hope we haven't screwed it up too badly. It probably won't be we're probably still going to have like a lot of the same basic technology as we do today, because if you look back at the projections from the past about like how everything's going to be totally different by 2020, that ain't the case. So uh Mr. Despair, any book you would recommend to someone struggling with regrets? It really depends on what you regret. um so I don't think I have much more to say about that. Rakesh, if you want to choose between nihilism and existentialism, which one do you prefer? That's not even a question for me. Existentialism. I draw on existentialism pretty heavily. Um, FGH. I don't really pay attention to antinatalism, so um, that's not going to be helpful. Cohen Davis. Do you know any Asian or African philosophy? Yeah, I mean I've taught classes on African or Africana philosophy when I was at Fayetteville State University, and I've taught classes on Asian philosophy when I was working for Ball State University. So I've read around. I'm not an expert in the field, so I can't, I don't know, I can't read like classic Chinese or Sanskrit, so I'm a little bit leery about, pontificating about what's going on in texts myself. But yeah. Mr. Despair, have I read Holbeck? Haven't read Holbeck. Um, Mark Barrow, what if our investments in belief or theory draw us into petty bias? What if? Yeah, then you if you figure that out, try to pull yourself out of it. If not, maybe hopefully you if some other people can help you out, right? All right. Some thanks from Cellbot Bot VP Master 99. Just wanted to drop by, say thanks for saving my butt in philosophy last year. You helped me understand Descartes' discourse on method as well as Kant. That's very good. Um, The proof architect. Have you followed the recent Hong Kong protests? Protesters' opinion is that nonviolent pacifist demonstration is not feasible after the 2012 umbrella riots. How to analyze with philosophy? It's a good question. A lot of different ways you could. You could look at it, in sort of a cost-benefit, utilitarian way. What is likely to produce the best outcomes overall. You have to figure out what the right outcomes are. You might think of it in terms of rights, and upholding people's rights to say, basically the things that the British had in the legal system before the Chinese government, took over Hong Kong. And you could also look at it in terms of, the mores of the people. It's going to be difficult for mainland China to really assimilate Hong Kong, given how fundamentally different things are there. So I mean, there's a lot of things you could do. It's not something I've given a lot of thought to, although it's still developing, and it's mostly because I'm just so busy, you know. Tatan, I'm Sebastian from Chile. I've been watching your videos for some time. I've always wondered if you're a Christian Catholic. I mean, if you're a believer, can faith affect philosophy? Yeah, I mean, I'm going on the record. I'm Catholic. I'm not a particularly devout one. I've written a lot within the Catholic intellectual tradition. Did my dissertation on Maurice Blondel. I don't consider myself under some obligation to evangelize. And I'm not particularly happy with what I see going on in the church, sort of at the day-to-day level where we have a lot of problems. And, it's interesting. When I taught in Indiana State Prison, I was told I was going to be teaching religious study and philosophy classes. I was told, keep whatever religious affiliation you have to yourself. And it was a good thing I did, because there was a lot of, sort of knee-jerk anti-Catholic prejudice from people who had gone to sort of low church Protestant churches and really didn't know much and were reading people like Helen White and all of that. But it was also good that I did that, because that way I didn't have any of the other Catholics thinking they could get over on me or, know where I was coming from because they'd read a bit of Thomas Aquinas or something like that. I don't think, here's the thing that I always say. So when somebody says, oh, I'm a Christian, right? I always say, that's cool. How you doing with the Sermon on the Mount? Because otherwise, I don't want to hear any of your bullshit. I don't want to hear about Leviticus and, homosexuality. I don't want to hear about your views on Israel. I don't want to hear your views on, male-female relationships and gender roles. If you can't actually put into effect the Sermon on the Mount, which is a central sort of Christian teaching throughout the history of the church. All the rest is kind of just, posturing. And that usually shuts a lot of people up, I don't think it's really that important whether somebody is a Christian or a Catholic. I think we look at their philosophical work on its own grounds, All right. Zachary, thank you for sharing so much philosophy with the internet. I often suggest your videos to friends when they are interested. That's very good. I'm glad they're helpful for you. Jake, to what extent do you think it's possible to separate the philosopher as a person from their work? Depends on the work. I mean, G. Moore is a great example. He apparently he went on the record as saying that he didn't read much philosophy. He actually much preferred reading novels to reading other people's philosophy. It was kind of a job that he did, and he was pretty good at it, but he could have done other things instead. Okay, that's quite different than, say, Nietzsche, right? So it depends on the philosopher and the philosophy. I don't think you can completely generalize about that. And this is a question, I suppose, that maybe philosophers themselves think about, to what extent are they a person more than just their profession. I mean, you get into philosophy and do it if you're actually good at it, and you want to do live up to the sort of spirit of philosophy, whatever that is, because you find something there that is really valuable and you think needs to be engaged with. Otherwise, you're just a placeholder. And there's lots of placeholders in academic philosophy, um, just kind of taking up space. They should get the fuck out of the way so other people can do better work than them. But there are also a lot of people who are really, really committed, and they're doing what they're doing because they see something really valuable there. All right. Made of clay. What determines the value of a human life? Is there something undeniable that gives a human its worth? Am I even asking the right question when it comes to value and human? I mean, I think you can say that if you're asking the thing like, where's the cutoff, right? When's it okay to kill this person? When's it not? I think that's a different question than like, what do we fundamentally share in common that gives us value? I would say personhood. Not an answer that was recognized as such in a lot of ancient philosophy, but you can read it back in there. And it's when we think of like going beyond the mere animal and what the entire scope of being a rational animal brings to it. I think that's part of it. Not that as we're discovering by observing animal behavior, not that animal behavior isn't very, very complex and contains many of the things that we think are valuable, like the capacity to empathize, or we mentioned play earlier on. Being able to play with others is something important too. All right. Callum Copwer, do I do work on J.L. Austin perception theory? I think, that's a very easy question to answer just by, looking at my stuff. The answer is no. Right? Mike Ray, what are your thoughts on dubious folks using Christianity to justify hatred of the LGBTQ? Is there a Christian case for acceptance of gays, or are said dubious folks correct? Is someone cherry picking? Well, like I mentioned, I think a lot of Christians are not really Christians. I think that, and I'll go on record as saying this. I think that the conservative Catholics and evangelicals in this country who have hitched their wagon to Trump's star ceased being even what level of Christian they had at that time, because their policies are so unrecognizable from a Christian perspective. That's rooted in the actual example and teachings of Christ, or the historical teachings of the church. I mean, if you want to know what the church has to say about economics, there was Labora Mexicans, right? And before that, there was Rerum Novarum. And if you read that sort of stuff, you can't be a libertarian, or you can't be, a business gets to do whatever the hell they want kind of person. Now, going back to the LGBTQ question, right? We know a good bit more about human drives and behavior. The whole question of like, is it a choice or is it determined? That's a bullshit question. We need to look at like individual people and say there's probably like this much in this case and this much in this case. When people are decrying homosexuality as a sin or anything else, being queer, but they're engaging in adulterous behavior themselves. Adulterous behavior is defined by, say, again, the Sermon on the Mount, right? Then they're full of crap, and they don't deserve to be taken seriously, and they should just be called antichrists, because that's really what they are. They're against the message of the founder. And whatever they're doing is probably, there's some good in what they do, and the rest of it is just spreading crap. I'm glad today that things are not, at least in some areas, what they were like when I was a kid. I mean, I'm not gay, right? I'm heterosexual. But I remember seeing kids mercilessly bullied, sometimes to the point of being terribly beaten, for even some of them weren't even gay. They just did the wrong thing. Everyone was sort of on edge all the time. Now, you can't attribute all of that to conservative Christianity. There's plenty of other cultural things as well going on, but that played a role in it. And people who like are nostalgic for that time, I think they're idiots. Now that said, on the other side, so now that I've pissed off people on the conservative side, let me piss off people on the left. There's an awful lot of posturing, and like I have to like be every space has to be my space. And it's one thing to say I should have a safe space. It's another thing to say I should be able to get in everybody's face all the time about my sexuality. Well, that's bullshit too. You know, we all have to live together, and you know, there's a lot of people doing a lot of posturing around. But right now, I think for me, I'm more repulsed by the right than I am by the left, and that's different because if you'd asked me 10 years ago, it would have been the opposite. And maybe 10 years from now, it will be the opposite for me. But right now, that's where I sit on that. All right. Oh, here's a really interesting question from Khalil. Thank you for all your public service as a philosophy educator. On a more personal note, how are you feeling about where you are in life at this moment in your life? Good question. So I'm going to turn 50 next August. And instead of like waiting for to reach 50 before I start making some resolutions and thinking about stuff, I decided it would make more sense for me to decide what I want to be the case by the time that I'm 50. So, am I happy with where things currently are? No. Um, I would like to more or less have sorted out what I'm going to be doing professionally. I do a lot of different things. Um, I'm teaching, way too many classes this semester. I don't want to do that anymore. Instead, I want to be spending more time doing client-based work. I'm doing a lot of that too, but I want to do more of that. I want to do a lot more writing. I want to continue video production. I want to do a lot more public speaking, and I want to build out my own online classes, which I've done a little bit, but I haven't done to the degree I'd like. I want to teach basically just for institutions where I feel valued, which is not always the case. And so that's the professional side of things. And I've made sort of commitments that I haven't always been able to follow through on, especially in terms of book projects. I'd like to get those books written. I'd like to have, a sort of better connection with my kids, being more involved in their life, and that's tough to do because they live at a distance. I'm divorced, and they're 2 states away, and they're quite occupied with their own things going on. But I want to be fully there when they're here, and I try calling just about every night. Don't always reach them. I can't do it when I'm teaching or other things like that to become more regular, but that's not entirely up to me. And I'd like to spend more time with my biological father and my half brother and sister. That's important to me as well. Obviously, I want to lose some weight, exercise more regularly, get back into not the shape I was in my 20s, but closer to that than where I've been. Work on my personality in certain respects. There's a lot of things, and I've got a lot of matters that I need time in order to really think through. When I was 11, my dad died, and I was told as I was turning 12 that I was now the man of the house. Didn't even cry at his funeral. Took me years to do that later. And there's a lot of things unresolved about what it was like to grow up when I did. So I want to work through those things as well. So that's my feeling about where I am at this moment in my life. I'd also like to, be a better teacher in some respects. So, all right, Dangerous Kitty, can you talk about some of your favorite philosophical films or movies to look at from that perfect A little bit of follow up. How about the ethical implications of movies like It's a Wonderful Life or Groundhog Day or Dark Knight? Well, those are kind of, obvious ones, right? Groundhog Day is about what would your life be like if you have to repeat it over and over again. It was redone recently with that one with oh, what is her name? Natasha something. Um, Russian Doll. It was pretty good. We were just talking about this actually at the book signing for Veronica Roth's new short stories. Somebody came up to me afterwards and they were talking about Philip K. Dick, and they said, "What's your favorite movie uh, uh, focused on Philip K. or grounded in Philip K. Dick's stories?" And I thought, well, I really do like Blade Runner, but it's not very faithful to the story. And my favorite Dick novel has shifted from being Man in the High Castle, which I felt to be the best a couple of years ago, to Scanner Darkly, and that was a really good movie. Raised a lot of key issues in a way faithful to the author, I'd say. So there's quite a bit of that. Zachary Little, fringe science is a great word that people ought to start using more often. There's a great deal of things in physics that have a scientific rigor backing them, but are not the mainstream opinion. Okay. Dan the Man, I know you've said you listen to metal. Did you ever listen to Death? I used to love them so much back in high school. Their final album was very influenced by Nietzsche. I think I've listened to them before, but I didn't really get into them. I don't like all metal. I mean, I'm not into Slayer. I like thrash metal, but I'm into other. I never got into Slayer. That somehow never just clicked. Um, so you can like a whole genre without getting into a particular group. The stuff I'm into is a bit earlier in time. When did Death come up? I mean, they're still touring, right? um, let's see here. Oh, okay, formed in '83, so they go back quite a ways. Yeah, here we go. Pioneering force in the extreme metal subgenre of death metal. Not into death metal. Just not my shtick. So, all right, 21 Studios says great channel, longtime fan. Well, thanks. That's very nice of you to say, and thanks for the contribution. All right, FGH, did you watch the new Joker movie? Is it out already? Yeah, it is out already now, right? I've been so busy lately with 7 classes, Stoic Week starting Monday, Stoicon X here, all these things going on that I've been seeing ads for it, but I didn't realize that it was already out. Um, it doesn't actually look very interesting to me, I have to say. And I do like Joaquin Phoenix, but I think we're going to make the decision not to see it in the theater and just see it when it comes to wherever, Netflix or Hulu or something like that. Human evolution. How would you recommend to learn ancient Greek? Again, just like with the Latin question, depends on the student, right? There is no recipe for that. There's a lot of different approaches. So you want to figure out what kind of student you are, and then find resources that other people like you say are useful. Quinn, any thoughts or tips for SCOTUS? Well, I mean, SCOTUS is tough. Um, don't expect it to be like Thomas, I guess. Um, all right, Giovanna has a really good question. I keep seeing talk of virtue ethics in contrast with legalism. I don't recognize the name virtue ethics from my time in university or grad school, but from what I've been able to read about it, it seems what we used to call principalism. Those sound like words from a textbook sort of treatment of moral theory. Legalism is usually going to be contrasted against not necessarily virtue ethics, but things like love-based approach or more flexible approaches. And the idea behind legalism. So another word for legalism would be a certain kind of deontology, right? And I was just talking about this in my business ethics class last week. When we use this broad term deontology, it comes from the word deon in Greek, which means, should or obligation. Day is used as a sort of generic uh, verb. And deontology can come in a couple different versions. You could have like Immanuel Kant. His ethics is a deontological ethics, but it's based on a central principle, the categorical imperative, which then can be unpacked in three different ways. And it's very it's very complicated in certain respects, but Kant also thinks the ordinary person can understand it. But there's some things built into it that would say that like mere rule following for the sake of rule following, that's not what Kant is about. Or if you take Ross, and Robert Audi's more pluralistic approach with prima facie duties, that's a deontological conception. You could say that Stoicism and Confucianism as approaches are fairly deontological as well, but there's like some reasoning given for why are these the rules? Why is this a duty, right? A legalist doesn't really care about that sort of stuff. They're like, the rules are the rules are the rules are the rules. They got to put them in practice, So there's that. Now, virtue ethics, that's a broad designator that includes, Platonic philosophy and Aristotelian philosophy, Stoic philosophy, arguably even classical Epicurean philosophy. I mean, they didn't think that the virtues were good for their own sake, but they did think the virtues were good. So, those. Then you've got Christian virtue ethics, and you can even if you're doing comparative philosophy, talk about the treatment of the virtues in other areas, right? So Confucianism is kind of a virtue ethics as well. A lot of indigenous approaches are essentially virtue ethics, and what makes it virtue ethics is the notion that there's important character traits that you want to cultivate, and they're not just about like social approval or anything like that. They're genuinely good for that person to have, and they're also generally good they're going to govern their behavior towards others and make them fit into society better. And they can't be reduced to algorithms or rules or anything like that. That's another key thing in virtue ethics, the notion that you can't reduce things to a set of laws. You need to cultivate what we call practical wisdom or prudence, and you need to exercise good judgment. So that's central to the virtue ethics thing. If what you called principlism means having some ethical principles and following those, that that kind of fits in with virtue ethics, but because you can say ethical principles serve roles in virtue ethics, but it's not quite the same, right? So hopefully that helps out with that. Let's scroll back up and see what we got. Actually, we're now getting close to the time when I'm going to have to like just pick a few things that I can answer fairly easily or straightforwardly. Zachary has a good question here. What qualifications makes one a philosopher? There's no single definition of philosophy. And given the fact that we have, you can say philosophy is kind of split over a whole bunch of different traditions, some of which we assemble under these broad headings like continental or analytic or history of philosophy or comparative or classical American or Thomistic or whatever, right? It's not like there's a checklist that would be accepted across the board. And some of those big picture things, like you ask an analytic philosopher, what is philosophy? They're like, oh, that's not really a question I can answer. Perhaps it's not a well-formed concept, or then they bring out Wittgenstein's quip, it's the disease of which it should be the cure. But ask continental people what philosophy is too, and they often can't quite tell you. So there isn't really a good answer to that question. there's no there's no one criterion, I guess you could say, that we can apply. All right, so let me start grabbing some stuff out of the air and see what we've got here. Oh, here's a good one from Alejandro about Lacan, right? What would you recommend to read to get into Lacan? I've been getting interested in his work, but I don't know where to start. So this is going to be a little counterintuitive. Don't start with the écrits. The écrits are quite difficult, deliberately so. Lacan is often showing off or sticking it to somebody, and you're not even sure who's this preface for, right? Um, and it's like a hodgepodge of different papers from different points. Start with his seminars. Um, those are quite accessible. They're still difficult, but they're way more accessible than the écrit. And I'm actually moving forward a bit because there's also another book that I think I would recommend. It's very short, and I bought this a number of years ago. Uh, it's kind of interesting. It's called The Triumph of Religion, preceded by the Discourse to Catholics. Like the context that Lacan was in, there were many Catholic thinkers, and Lacan himself thought he was an atheist, but he thought that contemporary atheists were kind of screwing things up. Like if he were around today, he wouldn't like the new atheists, because he thought that Christianity, although you could say like literally false, was sort of figuratively true, and that we would be impoverished by trying to take it completely out of the scope of things. So I would check that out. Um, Giovanna has a follow up. We had legalism, intentionalism, consequentialism, and situationism. Yeah, I mean those are the sort of things. Those are categories that are probably coming from some textbook approach. They're not broadly recognized in moral philosophy. Um, that sounds like the sort of thing you'd get in a seminary. I don't know if that's correct, but so legalism you could say deontology at sort of a low level. Intentionalism is saying that, okay, so what you've got there, if you're talking about Abelard, only the intention really matters. That's a lot more like Kant, right? Situationism, yeah. Fletcher wrote Situation Ethics. Fletcher said that everything should be motivated by love, but we can't sort of categorize that. And a lot of people thought that Fletcher was basically just justifying relativism of some sort, you know. So yeah. All right. Let's see what else I can grab on the way out. I'm gonna have to do my Hegel thing before too long, and I've got some other work. I'm also I'll mention this, going to my wife's 30-year class reunion tonight, which should be kind of interesting. I've never gone to any of my class reunions, and I don't know if she went to any of hers, but we're going to be like, getting to meet some of the people she went to high school with, so that should be kind of cool. All right, let's see what else we got here. Doo-doo-doo. Oh, here's a great question by Tyler Jocks. Do you find it harder to focus when you're reading in this age of social media and online distractions? I do. And I have to make an effort to put my phone down. I'm not sure where my phone is right now. It's around here somewhere. I was going to use it as a prop. I have to make a deliberate effort not to, oh, there it is, not to, get on the phone and like see what's happening on Twitter or how many emails I've got and stuff like that. And it's good to make that part of your sort of reading discipline. I don't think you have to necessarily do things like, put your phone away, so it can't be looked at or anything like that. But it is a serious problem right now. There's what we call, illiteracy, when people can't read, and then there's what we can call alliteracy. That's when they don't know how to read well. And if what you're used to reading is just, texts and blog entries and stuff like that, sitting down to read a complex book written at a time when that sort of electronic stuff was not the norm, and the only really distracting, you know, thing like that would be like newspapers or television. It can be very tough. And I, actually, so this is how I'll end because it's now almost 1:30 here. I'll say that what we ought to think about is not, whether we're screwing it up, right? We're going to screw it up. Anything that's a temptation, you will give into that temptation at one point or another. It's important instead that you recognize when you fail. You recognize when, like, you didn't pay attention to a passage because somebody distracted you. You distracted yourself with the technology. But then you get yourself up and you say, all right, I'm going to go back to this. And there will be some days where you can't actually get back into it. But you just try it the next day. And the more that you stick with it, provided you're not like getting down on yourself about it, you will eventually either acquire that habit that you didn't have, or you'll get it back. There are many people who really need to do that these days. And like I'm saying, there's more of a distraction because of that now. So we have to make more of a deliberate effort in order to not be distracted by that. And that's just the burden that we labor under. So I'm going to end there. And thanks for all of the questions. It looks like there were quite a few conversations people were carrying out in the chat window while I was talking about things. Thanks, everybody, for showing up. And we'll do this again, of course, next month. By the time that happens, I will have a little bit less on my plate. So have a great afternoon if you're here in this area, or evening, or morning, depending on where you are, or if it's the middle of the night, like Australia or China or India. Hope you have a great whatever it happens to be.